Hi everyone, and welcome to what is for many of you a highly anticipated video, House of the Dragon Costumes Review, Part 1. I'll cover the costumes from the first 5 episodes of Season 1 in this video, and the rest of the costumes in Part 2, which will be coming at some time in the future. I'll try to comment on many outfits, not all, but on most, though it won't always be in a chronological order. First, I must say that I'm really enjoying this show. Maybe the bar is just low because the Rings of Power is pretty bad, but House of the Dragon is pretty darn nice. I won't discuss the plot in these videos because there is plenty to focus on in the costumes department. I will give a few general impressions though, and there will be a few spoilers, so whether you're already a subscriber or new to my channel, welcome and let's dive in. First, a few general things I want to point out. The show gives the viewer the feeling that it's set in the same fictional universe as Game of Thrones, as it should. The music is spot on, the set design looks good, characters are nuanced and their motivations are believable. The first few episodes didn't hook me in as much, but I've been really enjoying each episode more and more, and as of writing this video, I've just seen episode 8. No spoilers, but that was pretty great. The costumes look like they're made with care and intent. They have that Game of Thrones vibe that the previous show established. They feel like their own thing, but there are some historical influences to help ground the show in this fictional reality, as everything else from social structure to political structure is already grounded, so it makes sense that the costumes should somehow be anchored into a fictional reality too. As to those subtle historical influences in the garments, I'll mention a few when I discuss individual costumes. There is definitely a theme in terms of the era of the historical influence, later medieval period, but the costume designer for the House of the Dragon costumes did make references to the medieval times, to the Renaissance, and to the Byzantine era. The costumes also look well tailored and flattering on the actors. I especially love the care that was put into the embroidery, and overall, my impression of the costumes is that they're pretty damn great. Now let's go and check some of the individual costumes out. Episode 1 had some pretty interesting pieces. I'll start with Alicent's blue dress. The cut and fit remind me vaguely of a medieval kirtle. I'm not that familiar with the medieval era, but I did some research when I was writing the script for this video, of course, and I found a few paintings that depict even this similar style of sleeve, which I think is pretty cool. And Rhaenyra's gold dress, again, pretty simple but very nice fabrics, lovely brocade down the front. I also think that when she and Alicent are together in a few scenes in these respective dresses, we get the feeling that Rhaenyra's is a little bit more luxurious because of the fabric and the embroidery and the accessories, so it's a subtle hint that she's a princess and, well, has a bit of a higher status. And I'll get to the colors in a moment. At the tournament, we see some more interesting designs for both girls. For Rhaenyra, this color wasn't my favorite at first, but the more I look at it, the more it's kind of growing on me. It's reminiscent of those Elizabethan ruffs, but I also see a bit of dragon in it. Alicent's dress has this bodice with straps that cross over, which looks kind of modern, but it's incorporated into a design that overall looks fitting. Again, I love seeing those layers and texture, even though the costume is more or less one color. I noticed how they put both girls in a lot of pastels in the earlier episodes, which gives them a sort of innocence and is telling of their youth. Especially in Alicent's case, I noticed these light blues at first, and then when she's, spoilers alert, Queen, she's wearing bolder, darker colors, and especially her iconic green. The armor looks like armor. The pieces seem like they are in place for a reason, not just to serve some aesthetic purpose. The material looks like steel, and the designs that they use as embellishments are interesting, and I think very well thought through and also very well executed. Daemon's armor is one of the more creative ones. It's kind of theatrical, but not too much. I can still believe that he could joust in this, and aesthetically, the dragon design looks good. It stands out, but it's not overly ridiculous, I think. And I love the little rubies that are added into the armor. That's a very nice touch. Princess Rhaenys' dress here is not my favorite, to be honest. The fabrics are nice, but personally, I'm not a fan of the pattern they used here. I get it, it's probably supposed to be reminiscent of waves, relating to the House Velaryon, but it's just not a personal favorite. What I do like is that even for extras, the garments look nice. The effort is there is clear but not too on-the-nose historical inspiration, And the last thing I want to mention for this episode is, of course, Rhaenyra's dress in the end when she is declared Viserys' heir. I was pretty sure that the headpiece was inspired by Russian court dresses, but then I read this quote from the designer in Harper's Bazaar, and the pieces kind of fell into place. So the designer mentions Byzantine influences, and I had to brush up a bit on my history knowledge, but in essence, the Byzantine Empire did have an influence on Russia and Eastern Europe. If we look back in history, there were influences in terms of religion, architecture, and culture in general, which of course encompasses some fashion styles as well. So I think what I noticed is something that was inspired in the past by another culture. In episode 2, we have another one of Rhaenyra's dresses, this interesting piece. And again, we see these light pastel shades because it seems pretty symbolic of her youth. Of course, she wears other colors too, for example, when she goes out riding, but I'm specifically referring to court dresses being light in color. Also, they even went with eyelets for the back closures, which is a really cool little detail. And like I said, it's similar with Alicent, who wears lighter shades first too, before she becomes queen, which I took as sort of symbolic transition into her maturity. I love the texture in Rhaenyra's white dress. It's really cool how the dress is all one type of fabric, but it's a textured sort of fabric, and they layer it to make it look even more interesting and like a proper garment, not just a cheap costume. I prefer this one of Rhaenys' dresses to the one in the first episode. The color is beautifully embroidered, and I think, much like a lot of the dresses, this one is also supposed to have some influences. For example, this is something I found that looks really close to her dress, and the painting is from the mid-1400s. The armor, I have to point out again, is really nice, creative, but still looks like armor. The helmets, though, are a bit strange, but the details, for example, here are really lovely. I don't know as much about men's fashion to be able to comment on anything particularly interesting, but once again, I like the attention to details, the layers, the choice of the fabrics, the silhouettes, especially, for example, Otto's costume, the vest with the buttons down the front, the high color, but of course still with a contemporary twist. Alicent's blue gown is a nice color, although I must say that I personally find it a tiny bit too modern with this neckline. Same with this white dress. They're tailored well and have a creative design, and to be fair, this half-modern approach has been a staple of the Game of Thrones series too, especially in later seasons. But like I said, for these fantasy or historical-ish fantasy shows, I personally prefer that the silhouette is more historically inspired because that grounds the fictional world in reality, even if that reality is of course made up, and the historical influences are only there in traces, which is understandable since it makes no sense to aim for actual historical accuracy and recreation in fiction. But again, you still want to ground it in some faraway place, both physically and time-wise, so reaching back in history for influences is, I think, a great way to anchor your fictional world in something tangible, something we understand and can make subconscious connections with. Like I said in the beginning, the political structure, the societal structure in these fantasy shows are based on our actual history, so it makes sense to apply that to costumes as well to a degree. It's never everything goes just because it's fiction. Sure, you can take creative liberties and decide how creative you want to be, but the more you establish the framework, the more consistent you are, the more believable a depiction will be, because it may be placed by its own fictional rules, but even those rules are rules and not arbitrary. But I digress. In episode 3, we see Rhaenyra's riding outfit again, and this costume is a really cool one. You can see the texture in the leather, it looks kind of like suede, and those dragon scale inspired elements on her shoulders and wrists look really interesting too. It looks like it could be vaguely inspired by women's riding habit. The silhouette looks more Victorian, probably because of the sleeves and the general silhouette, but the clasps in the front remind me of women's riding coats from the 18th century. Next, Alicent's red dress. It's certainly an interesting design, especially for a maternity gown. I'm not a fan of this pattern if I'm being nitpicky, but I do love the sleeves and the styling in general with the hairpiece. It's very reminiscent of the Italian Renaissance era. From what I could find, this beaded hairnet originated roughly in the 13th century in this style. It did exist way before, but I'm referring to this particular style, which is sort of late medieval Renaissance thing. And that V-shaped neckline, I'm not really familiar with this era of fashion as much, so feel free to add something or correct me, but I did find a few very similar mid-15th century styles, much like this dress, which is pretty neat. Then another one of Rhaenyra's, I guess, riding outfits. I really like the embroidery on this one. The outfit is simple, but the embroidery gives it something extra. Again, there's a bit of that dragon scale reference on the sleeves, it looks like. And the outfit looks elegant yet comfortable and practical. The choice of materials looks great. I like this look. Next is a court dress. I adore the sleeves. They are also a historical thing, I guess mid-15th century from what I could find. Really nice dress, and it suits her well. And lastly in this episode we have Daemon's armor, which has a really cool dragon inspiration, and it looks well constructed. Again, I'm far from familiar with armor, but this looks decent and interesting, weathered a bit just as you would expect, so pretty cool. Also, in the next episode, we get to see the seams on the shoulders, which are again a little nod to historical making of detachable sleeves. So here I think is a nice mix of fantasy elements, yet you can definitely tell that there are historical influences present. Rhaenyra's red dress here in episode 4 is a nice piece too. It's a lovely cut and very flattering on the actress. The red color I feel like gives her a sort of power in this scene where she's supposed to be picking her suitors, and even though she's far from being truly in charge of her destiny, it gives her this powerful aura. The sleeves are really cool, and the garment is kind of modern looking at first glance, at least to me. I still buy the idea that it comes from this fictional universe, because the materials and the cut of the dress convey some sort of historical influence. The sleeves give it some grace and elegance and make it both revealing, yet still kind of understated. It's definitely an interesting piece. Next we have her coat, which looks really luxurious, lots of texture, brocade, black and a bit of red peeping through, the Targaryen colors of course. And the clasps I think are also in the shape of dragons, which is a lovely detail, and far from the only one in the show. There's lots of nods to the houses and their sigils, accessories, clasps, and in all those sorts of things. The only piece I'm not that fond of is the crown. I like the shape and the engravings, but I can't quite discern what makes it look a bit off for me. I think it's that in certain light the colors look a bit plasticky, maybe. I'm being really nitpicky here, but it is the crown, so it's pretty important. Now onto the last garment of this episode, Rhaenyra's night shift. I want it, I need it, I love it. It's so beautifully full of frills and it looks handmade, it looks reminiscent of historical shifts, especially since for royalty and noble people they used to be a bit more lacy and full of ruffles, trims, and so on. And the best part of it is that it doesn't look too polished, it looks lived in, or well, like she didn't just get it brand new for this one scene. It goes to show the attention to detail to even the least relevant of garments, one might say. In episode 5, we get to see Alicent's green dress. We know that green is symbolic in reference to her house and a lot more, but also the garment in general is a great piece. It's such a statement dress. Not only does the color suit the actress, but the shape of the dress is very much historical. So this sexy front, which is very much in the spirit of this fictional universe, it's such a subtle alteration because historically you would have a shift or a layer underneath to cover this space between the clasps. But this is a little change that adds that modern seal, and it's in the spirit of House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones universe, yet it doesn't make the dress look completely different or too contemporary. It's a slight change, but it works perfectly for this fictional universe, I think. Lana's dress also has some historical influences. It's interesting and I like how they stay true to each house's color palette most of the time. I'm not crazy about this fabric, but the cut is interesting, the sleeves look nice, and again, even if we can't quite pin this dress to an era in history, which is fine, we can still subconsciously perceive those historical influences that make this fictional world feel like some non-specific parallel universe era from a distant past. I'm only putting this image here because look at the hand-sewn eyelet hole. You know how I adore details like this. Now, Rhaenyra's wedding dress and some of the outfits from that scene. The white dress is definitely eye-catching. I love the texture and these embellishments, though I do think it's a little bit extra, just aesthetically speaking, which fair enough, she's a princess, it's a big event, but I do think that with the dress embroidery and the straps and the jewelry and the elaborate hairstyle, the dress would still be equally impressive with an element or two fewer. Maybe even as little as removing these straps or the necklace would make it look a bit less jam-packed with everything, but again, that's a personal preference. Lana's dress is an interesting one too. These ruffles are really reminiscent of the waves or something, well, sea-inspired. Though I'm not sure where they got the inspiration for this cut. It looks like something closest to the mid-17th century to me, apart from the sleeves. I'm just pointing this out because most outfit inspirations seem to stem from roughly the same era, but this one stands out to me. So let me know if you recognize any other potential historical inspiration for this dress. Also, I'm ending with this image because this gold chain is absolutely wonderful. I really like it. From the design and intricacy to the Lannister lion imagery to the clear historical influence behind it, looks great. Now, I want to end this first part of the video by saying that I really admire the effort that clearly went into making these costumes. They don't look like they're from our universe, but they also don't look like costumes, which is perfect. The prevailing late medieval influences are something that's in common to most garments, which is really a cool detail, and I think it gives a sense of coherence to all the costumes in the show. I'm sorry I didn't talk as much about men's costumes, it's something I'm not that familiar with, so it's definitely harder to tackle, but I'll try to cover more men's garments in part 2. I can't promise you when the second part will be out, but I'll try to do it sometime in November. Let me know what you thought of the House of the Dragon if you watched it, and what you think about the costumes. You can also tell me what you're currently enjoying if you're not watching House of the Dragon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.